So I'd like to begin with land acknowledgement. I'm talking to you today from Chibuktuk, which is known in our settler colonial language as Halifax. And I find it particularly poignant to be thinking about what it means on the eve of Canada Day. I think a lot of people, settlers like myself, are not feeling particularly proud of Canada in this moment. And I know I'm struggling to understand what needs to happen and how to make it happen. So I'm grateful for this group and the conversations that we've been having, and really appreciate Chris George's time. So maybe we can jump in. And the way we did it last time, and I think we'll do this evening as well, is that ask Chris some questions about the readings that we had for this evening's discussion, which is basically the last half of Whose Land Is It Anyway? And then following, about 20 to 25 minutes of conversation, then I'll invite people to go into breakout rooms, and Ali will randomly put people in these smaller breakout rooms with a few questions to discuss. And then at the end, we'll come back and invite someone from each of the groups to share a little bit about your conversation. And if we have time, we'll take some questions as well. So let me start in with my first question, Chris.
Okay.
So in the first article, the one by Glenn Coulthard on land-based education and Indigenous resurgence, he says that at the heart of colonialism is the violent separation of our peoples from our social relation to the land. Any education aimed at decolonization must confront that violence. He then goes on to talk about the importance of an education that reintroduces Indigenous peoples to the land and connects them with the knowledge holders who are experts in living in it. Now I know you're involved in this cultural resurgence, and I'm wondering if you can talk about what it looks like for you.
I wanted to grab Glenn Coulthard's book. I've been reading this book here. It's Red Skin, White Masks, and he expounds on a lot of those ideas that he shares in there, and it's very informative. For Glenn Coulthard's article, when you ask that question, the heart of colonialism is a violent separation of our peoples from our social relation to the land. And I also add to that our political and economic relationship to the land as well. And for me, that's what brought me to this place in my life right now. I'm an educator. I came in to do my master's degree to look at language revitalization, cultural revitalization, what's happening around the world as far as Indigenous people who've been oppressed. Hawaiians, Maori have a lot of examples of, like we were low language use, and they reclaim their language. And a lot of it is a political battle. So for me, when I started looking into language revitalization and cultural resurgence, it's about land-based education. I started looking into land-based education, and I started finding out that there's all different interpretations of land-based education. That even I think in the 60s or 70s in Canada, there were like open air classrooms. There's a lot of big push to other schools bring outdoor land-based education. So I started really looking at the ideology, the what is it about learning. When I sentence, that's where my mind has been at lately. The Canadian state, because around the residential schooling, the Canadian state could not have stolen children from schools, or in the way Glenn Coulthard's talking about this way, without the Indian Act. Without the Indian Act in 1876, is there something okay? Did you miss me? Am I freezing up? You're muted.
Sorry, Chris, I missed the last few words. It sort of cut out. So if you could just go back a sentence, then
So
that'd
just
be
the
great.
idea of the violent separation with the residential schooling and the news that's been going on lately, that's where my mind has been at. And just to reiterate the politicalness of it, that without the Indian Act, the state would not have had the power or the authority or the justification, not that it's right or just to do that. You wouldn't have the Indian Act if you didn't have the British North America Act of 1867. And when you look behind the history of the creation of Canada, 18, it was created by an act in Parliament in London, the whole history around that. What really 1867 was a violation of, for us as Wabanaki peoples, our rights had been secured with the British crown, going back to 1725. And then when you look at the peace and friendship treaties, all of those were reestablishment or reaffirming our rights. All of a sudden, and then 1763 is looked at as the Royal Proclamation. And in that document, it lays out what rights Indigenous people are afforded, and the responsibilities and treaty partner. And that there's a lot of problems with the Royal Proclamation, but for all intents and purposes, that ultimately codified our relationship with England, and then eventually Canada, the provinces in Canada. But British North America Act violated that, and that so we're the Royal Proclamation in a lot of ways, at least in words, an argument can be made that that's sort of like that nation-to-nation relationship. That's what the spirit of the Royal Proclamation, although I do have arguments against that. And that there's two interpretations of all of these documents. There's the Indigenous interpretation and then the legal European British interpretation. And I think we all know about fine print in contracts today. And so that is multiple effects there. And so that, when I talk about violent separation, and to finish that question, education that reintroduces indigenous people to the land and connecting them. So I started out thinking as an educator, let's go on the land and let's start having outdoor classrooms, maybe for like in 1 period a day or 2 periods a day. And then that idea of decolonizing my lands. How did I learn to be a teacher? What educational philosophies did I learn? How much was Wabanaki compared to Eurocentric or whatever? And I started looking into that argument and that issue of, so how do we return to the land in indigenous ways, in Wabanaki ways? And that's where connecting with elders and knowledge holders, because for me, I don't have my language. I depend on a lot. I didn't grow up in my culture and my ceremony. It was very tangentially. I was connected to it, but I didn't grow up in it. So, and as I started doing that as an undergrad at 19, it's from there until where I'm at now. I've just always been doing that. And now, especially with research, much more formally, so that returning to the land is not so much more to me than just going past for me, it involved political consciousness. I had to raise my awareness because I avoided politics and courts and all that kind of stuff as much as I could, because that's not my strong suit. So I had to raise my awareness of what our rights were, how we got to this point in time. So for me, returning to the land now, that's where my research is, and I'll share. I just wrote a paper for one of my dissertation projects. I'll share that through the club here. I'd love your opinion on it. It's still it's like a peer review process, and I would really love your opinions on this if you care to share. And it's really about going back on the land in those traditional ways, and not just any land, but going back to the land where, like, I'm in the 7th district of the Mi'kmaq Nation. That's like on the North Shore of New Brunswick. So it's going back in the land, hunting, fishing in those traditional ways, following the seasons, following those teachings. And then I've also learned along the way. So there's a couple of groups. There's one, I forget the name of Indigenous group right now. They're in the Toronto area, and they're an island community in that area, right around the Toronto area. I forget their community names, but they worked with like the survivalist. A guy from their community is a survivalist that spent 10 years going to learn how to live off the land. When he came back to his community, him and the other people like me, provincially trained teachers, they revamped their school, decolonized their school. So he would take the kids out, like he was talking about, it just snowed. So they took kids out, teaching them how to track animals, what were the animals, and following that. And then when they get back to the classroom, like they're doing that in their language when they're on the land, or as much as they can. But when they get back to the classroom, they also are doing guided writing classes, biology classes, whatever, they have different courses attuned to the seasons. So it's kind of like blending those new knowledges and those kind of things. And I always fall back on that one protocol that it's all going to be locally defined. I have my idea and perspectives. And I should also note too that so Glenn Goulthard is talking about the Chinta Institute. I recommend taking a look at their website. They do offer programming, like 2-week programming. Some of their program is open to the public if ever that's something you or people you know about. But the people that are involved in that, Leanne Simpson started working there as well. So if you follow Leanne Simpson's work, it's all about Indigenous resurgence in this ancestral way, these traditional ways. But there's also, I did meet one person. There was a moose hide tanning camp here last 2 summers ago at the burial grounds here in group from that area, the Yellow Knives Dene territory, and they were working with like Mi'kmaq, the Women of First Light. Have you heard of the Women of First Light?
I'm sure lots of people haven't, though. So if you want to say something about them,
well, maybe we'll put a link on that on the page as well. There's another group much like this, not a book club, but it's through the Tatamagouche Center, I believe.
Okay.
I think it's also partnered with the United Church in that area there too. And it's a we're a matriarchy. That's, as Wabanaki peoples, we have matrifocal teachings. It's so ideologically different than public schooling. That's what I'm talking about. It's not just about getting onto the land, but doing it in matriarchal ways. And the Women of the First Light hosted this moose hide tanning camp, and one of the people that came to speak, like, she was resistant to just some of the intellectual property. When you're talking about taking traditional ancestral teachings and using them for post-secondary education or schooling, you're always going to have these intellectual property issues and who owns the program. That's always going to be a challenge. So I just want to put that caveat when you go research about the Chinta.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about that kind of rather large caveat, because, for all I know, there are teachers on this call who teach in public schools. And, I know from being a parent that there's very little education about Indigenous peoples and Indigenous history, at least in Mi'kmaq that I'm aware of, because I grew up here too. But I guess, what can I and others do to support the kind of resurgence that you're talking about, but also the kind of awakening that's required for our children, our education system that, we're kind of, we've got right now. We aren't going to be able to get most settler schools to adopt a radically different approach.
Yeah, it's hard to say what anyone can really do, because like the conflict I'm presenting, or the issue, the phenomenon that, like, there's a lot of reconciliation within the school systems. Public school systems at every level has made huge strides to include Indigenous voices, Indigenous culture, languages as much as they can. I feel that they've tried doing their own way, but as long as we are, like for New Brunswick, there's an Anglophone and Francophone. As long as we're in the Anglophone sector, as long as we're like, it comes down to your personal politics, values. I'm not sure what the language is, but for me, Meghamahan, the circle of Indigenous folk that I work with, we're really committed to, we refer to it as restorative reconciliation, restoring what was taken, our identity, our language, our land-based literacies and things like that. You know, when we go to the public school, you still deal with the fundamental issues of language, even though most of our people in our communities speak English. If we want to get on that path of speaking our languages again, and the most important thing with languages are an encyclopedia. I hear that all the time from the research. When a language goes extinct, so does that whole unique identity and worldview. So we're definitely much in the revitalizing and trying to as much as we can. Andrea Baird Nicholas at St. Thomas University has done wonderful things for the Wolastoqey language in that. You can look at some of the program that she's been working with through St. Thomas University. But other than her programming, there's really been no push towards total immersion. She refers to it as mother tongue medium of instruction. And there's a lot of, like, within the educational data, research, and literature, the idea of bilingual teaching, that you teach in the language, and then you also include English as well. These approaches to learning, they can be done. That's how people in New Zealand, they refer to them as language nests. Hawaii, New Zealand, parts of Southwest United States. That's how they've done it. So it's not so much about getting back on the land or the lake. It's doing it with purpose and doing it with that. And that's the challenge. That's the challenge that we come across. A lot of people that I know in my circle who are Indigenous, and I pitch this idea to them, especially if they're educators, these theories that we can bring back our language. Not a lot of our people feel that is possible. Some people don't feel that it's not possible, or that it's possible or not possible is beside the point. Why do that? We're going to speak English. We speak English, 20 hours out of the day or whatever, like there's always these kind of arguments that people have against doing that. And then that's just the conversation. And then when you're sitting down to actually do the work, that's where I am right now, where I'm looking into how do we reclaim education when everyone who's Indigenous in New Brunswick, who's working in education, is on board. Majority, almost everyone I know is on board with what the universities are doing or the province is doing. They don't see the broader, the more comprehensive issues that you have to really look deep at and think long term on. And so how do you convince our own people? So that is a huge challenge. And I'll just end with, so that's a huge question we hear a lot, and it provokes a lot of debate. What can we do to help, or how can we help? And one of the reasons why I'm feeling so heavy, and not only the residential school children, I actually, as sad as that is, I was having conversations with a traditional chief the other night and talking that there are some elders, and I agree with them, that these young people are coming back for a reason. The idea that we have to we have to critically analyze and fight our colonizers. We have to call them colonizers. We have to create this kind of adversarial conversation when it comes to talking anything Canada or New Brunswick or Nova Scotia. We're put in this position of using these terms, colonizer, and it sometimes can make you a pariah. So when we see these bodies, these children being found and discovered, and these souls coming, for us, we always say the truth, the idea that concept that we don't need to argue, scream, and yell. The truth is on our side. We know what happened. It's just been obfuscated for so long, covered up. And so we're seeing these ancestors coming back and giving us a shot in the arm, in the sense that, like, I think society, for the most part, is like, how do you all feel about that? How do you feel that this is unbelievable amounts of genocide? It's the stuff that I read in the history, and I've known about, but to see these numbers, it's so frustrating. And then on top of that, while this is all happening, so to go back to that argument that without the Indian Act, you can't steal children without the Indian Act, you can't have the Indian Act without British North America Act. all that British North America Act, the main problem with that is it undermines our sovereignty. That sovereignty that for us, Wabanaki, Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqey, Penobscot, Passamaquoddy nations from 1600 fought tooth and nail with invading peoples of all sorts from all different parts of Europe throughout generations to secure those rights in 1725. And that, we're still having to go back and argue. So that's what that British North America Act does, is cut that away. And while we are celebrating or talking about Aboriginal Day on June 21st, Bill C-15 passes into law.
I know.
And no one's paying attention to that or talking about it. So what that really means, when you really get to the nitty gritty of Bill C-15,
let's just tell people here what Bill C-15 is, because
so Bill C-15 is it's connected to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. UNDRIP is the terminology. And 2016, Justin Trudeau put forward a challenge or a campaign promise to recognize Indigenous rights, and he put together a rights reconciliation framework, rights recognition framework. Sorry. So it's about his idea, his words at the beginning. When I first started my master's degree, I bought hook, line, and sinker into this. I was very naive to politics and political speak. So when he said that his most sacred obligation is that nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous folk, I bought that hook, line, and sinker. And so much that I went back to school. Like, I was in school already doing that. And, and then UNDRIP, I was really buying into that. And when you really look deep into these, so UNDRIP, 2007, in 2000, when was that, 2020? Just recently, they put forward this Bill C-15, which is meant to put into Canada law that Canada's laws have to respect this International Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. On paper, it looks like Canada is entering into a political relationship where they are going to be held accountable whenever they want to invade land or put a resource project where it's not wanted. But when you dig through that, and especially the preamble of that, it just shows how this, just very much like the British North America Act, very much like we do, we did at the beginning of this session, we have a land acknowledgement, we recognize Indigenous rights, but then we go ahead and deny those rights. If we recognize that we have rights, this unceded, unsurrendered land. But what happens when grandmothers in Sissenbrook, a little place right outside of Fredericton here, decide to set up a camp there to restrict fracking exploration? Oh, well, you can't go on your land. It's your land, but you can't go on it. Those questions percolated in my mind, and I kept wanting to understand why. And we have that's what happens, is like, we're going to be hearing about what just happened with Bill C-15 and how that just really undermines a lot of the work that a lot of people are doing. And I just wanted to just kind of say that that's happening. That's how politics work. While we're paying attention to one thing, another big argument with Bill C-15, because it deals with Indigenous rights and it's such a monumental issue, international, world, global issue, the original rights holders are the Indigenous peoples. They should be consulted. When you look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1996, those were commissioned reports. They interviewed up to 3,000 people, maybe even over 3,000 Indigenous peoples. Very qualitative, sitting down, listen. You can go, if you want to learn more and read more, that TRC report is chock full of testimonies of people from the Kamloops schools, and they're talking about burying bodies and all this kind of stuff. So people should have known about this. People, especially politicians. I'm kind of, I feel like I'm rambling.
Well, no, everything you're saying is so important. I want to pick up on a few threads.
Sure.
Starting with, without the Indian Act, there couldn't have been stolen children. So one of the things that stood out for me as the, revelation discoveries of the mass graves is that suddenly Prime Minister Trudeau was talking about how the Pope really should apologize. And I'm not saying the Pope shouldn't apologize, but all of a sudden it just seemed like it was all the church's fault, and somehow the colonial government had nothing to do with it and was as surprised as everybody else. I mean, I don't know. It's just, I don't know if there's a question there. It's just kind of my draw jobs.
Yeah, I saw a question in there about it was a TRC report, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada.
Yeah, and I sent a link out in the newsletter that went out this afternoon. So if you didn't get the newsletter, Ali can, yeah, if you put your email or reach out to Ali, she'll put you on the list. As well as the recommendations from, or the calls to justice from the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women.
It's hard to say about the apologies and things like that, because it is very it is performance almost in a lot of ways, or
Mm-hmm.
you know, there's one thing about taking accountability, and then, you know, in words,
Mm-hmm.
and then in action, and you know, again, becoming politically aware of the situation we're facing, and seeing all the cards that are up. You know, there's a lot of, like, that Bill C-15 that passed into law on June 21st, to me was so cold-blooded. Language of liberty, reconciliation, democracy. As I'm so offended as an Indigenous person, and as a person with settler ancestry as well, that a country can just so coldly, especially in light of so many discoveries of human remains. How can you just so cold-bloodedly just go ahead and do this? But this is Indigenous folk in Canada.
Yeah,
the Canadian state itself also supports the Organization of the American States, which is heavily involved in. There was a legitimate coup in Bolivia. 70% Indigenous folk in that community, the people that were couped against, I don't know how do you say that were victims of that coup, were predominantly Indigenous folk. Ecuador, Chile, Peru. It's in the media, not our media all the time. There are a couple of local sites down in South America that provide a lot of on-the-ground news. But Canada, as a part of the American states, supports that. They supported the coup in Bolivia. Canada's involvement in Yemen, if you don't know what's happening, and how not just Canada, but how other countries are involved in supporting that genocide. And where else are these? Well, I suppose genocide might be a little rough, but these forms of human conflict, you know, Afghanistan. There's so many places around that you can identify, and the Canadian state is involved in it. So that it happens at home to Indigenous folk is one thing that I'm upset with my country for, but that we are also exporting this almost as if this was like a testing ground in some ways. And, you know, we're partnering with the United States on this, and and at the same time, when we talk about the British North America Act and the creation of Canada, 1860s, 1870s, Canada was a part of the British Commonwealth. We still are, but so much more then. What was England doing? While they were using RCMP and stealing our children, if you have to look at what European countries were doing in India, in parts of Southeast Asia, in Africa, in parts of South America, it's like, as Indigenous folk, we use that term Indigenous because it's at an international level. It implies people who share a common language, a common homeland, and a common experience with imperialism or colonialism or some form of social oppression. I use the language now, suppression. It's really a lot like suppression.
Right.
Suppressing our rights, which is so much more gentler form of totalitarianism than oppression.
Yeah. Yeah, and especially if you can get people doing it to themselves because they're not, they don't feel good about who they are.
Well, that's where this book, I mean, it's very academic in a sense, but he's kind of doing a critical analysis. If anyone here listens to or follows Marx, and sort of like a Marxian approach to like how we're going to handle these problems we face
Right.
as a globe, as human beings. And
Sure.
so dealing with our political economy. So there's an idea of turning to some more communal forms of political economy. And they talk
Right.
about Marx, but one thing that they don't really talk about is, well, I don't really want to get into that too deep, but he critiques that Marx, for
Hmm.
indigenous folk, we have our own
Philosophies
political
and
economies,
yeah,
our own
yeah,
philosophies.
sure. I just want to throw in one more question, and then we better get to the breakout group. Um, let me see here. The let's pull up the question. In Pam Palmater's essay, she talks about how sort of the atrocities committed against Indigenous people, and we heard it even over the last few weeks with the finding these unmarked graves. Somehow it's talked about as though it's part of a colonial legacy that's in the past, and that what we need is, an apology, and so that everybody can move on. So Pam talks about how there's this kind of push for Indigenous people to get over it. What's in the past was in the past. We're really sorry. And so when our prime minister, chokes up with tears, that's supposed to sort of do the trick. Tell us just briefly, why that is so messed up and why it's never going to work.
Well, to go back to the first article in this book, it's all about the land. The first couple articles, it's all about the land. So when we look at Bill C-15, what that really did is that just reasserted Crown. The title, the official term is underlying Crown authority, underlying Crown title, I believe is the actual term. It just reaffirms that that's based on doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, these old world ideas that when the first Europeans came here, there was no civilized society, so we can claim these empty barren lands, terra nullius, for our own. And there were some policies at the time that supported that, those doctrines. So when they discovered these lands, they claimed them for themselves. So when I look at the English Empire here, they claim that, and so long as that state, whether it's Canada, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Quebec, Maine, Vermont, United States, have that underlying Crown title, we're not in control of our lands, even though they recognize our unceded, unsurrendered lands. We can't build a hemp farm without the province's permission. We can't do anything in our territory without we can only have a right to sell our land, really. So in the literature around settler colonialism, so we have to recognize that our country, Canada, had went through a couple of changes. When we're talking about this colonial era that you're speaking about, that happened in the past, that was a British colonial era. That evolved into a settler colonial era in the sense that the descendants of those original colonists, the Atlantic provinces, the Atlantic colonies, lower Canada, when Canada happened in Confederation in 1867, it was a commonwealth of colonies. So it was sort of like an en masse denial of Indigenous sovereignty again, entitled to their homelands. And so the argument is that colonialism is a structure, not an event, and it's like a home. So if you watch a home reno show and you see the first 20 minutes of the home reno show, and it's a dilapidated old broken down house and they have to gut it out. Well, that's what Confederation was in a lot of ways, to put it plainly. Confederation was taking the original framework, the colonial colonies that were left after England got booted out of the United States in what would become Canada, and built on that. And all of that is dependent on a political economy, an economy that's built on resource extraction, whether it's timber, water, whatever it may be, and then real estate, so growth as populations grow and things like that. So as long as there's a continuous need for a political economy, as long as billionaires need to get more billions, as long as the economy needs to go, it's built on dispossession.
Yeah.
Even using that word can be problematic. But the idea it's built on that. And
Yes.
without going back to those, to go back to what I started this conversation with, to dealing with the Canadian Confederation in 1867, dealing with that travesty of justice,
Mm-hmm.
then that's the challenge. That's the hard
Sure.
part, because just look at what people are talking about canceling Canada Day.
Mm-hmm.
Think about like the response to that. If we tell Canadians that we have to have a refounding of the country that is based on these kind of these sharing principles, these egalitarian principles. Actually, they're very Longhouse indigenous concepts. You're going to get laughed out of City Hall. You're going to get laughed out of Parliament. No one's. I bring it up to people in all different areas that no one's going to go for that, because
The little quote I'd like to read is from Murray Sinclair's essay. It's on page 71, and that's from the Whose Land Is It Anyway book, which was the free downloadable PDF. And for anybody who doesn't know, Murray Sinclair was the chief commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And some of us have seen him recently in newscasts responding to the grieving that's been happening around the discovery of the mass graves. So Murray Sinclair says, I hope that the new generation of professionals and scholars can see that they are not just the bearers of burdens of history, but they are also the beneficiaries of our new awareness. They are not just inheriting the painful legacy of the past, they are also inheriting the awareness and knowledge of why and how things happened, well as a framework for defining Canada's new relationship with its Indigenous peoples. This is the edge of the future upon which we sit. So I leave you with that thought, and I wish everybody well as they, work through their feelings and learnings on all of this and meet what we have always called Canada Day. Okay. Thanks again, Chris, for
thank you all.
your time and your sharing incredible knowledge. And thanks everybody for your openness and for being part of this. Okay.
Thank you all. It's great to have a spot to share.
Yeah, it
There's
really
been so
is.
many negative responses. I've been dealing with trolls and all kinds of garbage, toxic mentality. So it's great to have people who are open.
You bet. You bet.
Enjoy your day tomorrow.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.